You see, in the church, when we read Romans 1 and started off with the vile affections, for even though women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. And in church, I think when we read that, when the preacher read it, the men and women would sort of glare around them, and remarks were made about events that occurred in the gay quarter, and heads were shaken and tut-tuts were pronounced. Because I think the men of the church, and perhaps the women too, thought to themselves, well, we don't do those things. We don't burn in our lust one toward another. And looking around at the congregation, really there was no reason to do that, because we were a misbegotten bunch of souls at the very best. But we men forget our unconscious sexual attraction to women in Hollywood, for example, in the movies. And when we examine those women sort of forensically, sometimes we have to conclude and understand that not all women that are shown to be women are actually women. This is a very old deception in the world. And there are men who are effeminate and who present as women, and they have very high value in the sexual marketplace, and men seek after them. And one can tut all one wants to, but Thailand shows us that a very beautiful transvestite or ladyboy will attract the attention of ostensibly straight men, of course. So it is, you meet with somebody that has the same sexual drives as you, that doesn't slip into that inverted position of dominance that sometimes afflicts marriages, and that can be a satisfying sexual partner. And it's not really our place to condemn those people at all. And Paul clarifies that when he starts chapter 2 of Romans and says, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself, for thou that judgest doest the same things. Of course, the list of things doesn't end with same-sex unions. It continues with being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication. Well, fornication is just, I suppose you could call it, sexual congress outside of any kind of a covenantal relationship. That's very common in the modern world. Hookups and friends with benefits and all these things. Prostitution, indeed, you could say. This is fornication, you could say that. You know, when I was speaking about the church being the world, and we contemplate the situation in Thailand, for example, where so many boys are raised as women and then sold in the marketplace effectively. And when one is raised up from a child as a woman and perhaps given hormones to encourage the development of breasts, retaining one's male identity and simultaneously becoming womanly, we have to think where this practice started. And it wasn't developed for tourism, although tourism was a consequence of it. Sexual tourism, as it were, to Asian lands where these things are practiced more openly and less apologetically. The demand for womanly boys originally would have come from the monasteries of Thailand and of Vietnam, the priestly class. They hold, perhaps still hold, and certainly held the reins of power in those superstitious cultures. And they have access to the money also and to the lands. And so the people would serve the monks with what the monks desired. And the monks desired to feed on strange flesh. The people involved in that, I mean, if you're raised up in that way, then I think you kind of can become a woman almost. And perhaps you're born differently also. This is another thing that we fail to remember. There are people who are born of uncertain gender. It's not entirely uncommon. And sometimes they're born with both sexual organs, and a choice must be made as to whether the person will be raised a woman or a man. These things are part and parcel of our world, and I repeat, it's not really for us to stand in judgment. Whosoever hath aught against his brother should resolve it before placing his offering at the altar, and agree quickly. The division between gay men and women and self-identifying Christians is, I believe, completely unscriptural and has no justification whatsoever. God knows how we are to conduct ourselves. It's from above that our path in the world is ordained. And we have the injunction to love our neighbour. There's no qualification of that. Love thy neighbour as thyself. It's quite a high level of love because, of course, we think highly of ourselves. So I would say that it's completely unscriptural to condemn gay men and women and hold oneself above them in any measure. We're all condemned. We're all the sinner on the cross. Doesn't really matter. Now, a verse that I find very helpful in the Bible is the verse in Proverbs 27. Iron sharpeneth iron, so man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. And that's, I think, commonly interpreted as having counsel among men. that by discourse and meetings we can improve, that we are cooperating. But really, we men are in competition one with the other. We don't give counsel to one another. It's a little bit impolite to do so. But we walk in the world, and our countenance can sharpen the countenance of another. So when you see a man who's walking as a man and walking proudly and righteously and in a virtuous way, then it will inspire you to up your game a little bit, perhaps. Perhaps you need to. I suppose we all do need to. The Bible understands this, how it is among men. And then we must engage in those works, which I think it's Peter that mentions that faith without works is dead. And when I speak of the freedom that we have in Christ, and that all we have to do is to believe, and that our works are unnecessary, and I speak sincerely, that's my understanding of the Bible. But the works that we do need to do are the works on ourselves. You know, if a man professes faith and then lives a reprobate life and is unfit and unhealthy, irascible, unkempt, unreliable, then works are lacking, because we have to do the work on ourselves, do the work, which involves getting fit, eating correctly, achieving our goals, working diligently. Those are the works, really. It's self-work that's referred to show yourself worthy before God. But the church has told us that it's more to do with going to cut your neighbour's grass or to look after the widow lady. And I don't know about the grass cutting, but, you know, certainly the widow lady should be catered for, and, you know, anybody needy should be catered for, and people who are begging on the street need to be given alms and given respect and love. To give generously and to not shrink back in horror and judgment. It's really not our place to do that, is it, at all? So those are the works that we need to engage in. Sadly, in the church, it's viewed as a kind of voluntary work and charity and helping others in a proud display of virtue, I suppose. But it's slightly arrogant to treat our brothers and sisters in that way, because all have sinned and all have come short of the glory of God, and that includes everybody, whoever you are, and however many times you've read the Bible. For so it is in our world. And we must, I believe, spread peace and understanding, and therefore we must have peace and understanding in our own heart. And anybody's particular sexual proclivities are none of our business whatsoever. They're private matters. Now, I suppose you could say, well, there's the gay pride and all the rest of it, and it's flaunted in front of our faces and almost thrust upon us at every turn. And I do see that, and it grieves me to see it. But it doesn't really require any condemnation, does it? It's a tolerable thing. We're not stricken down by the LGBT rainbow flag or anything. If they feel the need to fly a flag to celebrate their diversity, then more strength to them if that brings them joy and pleasure. They're still our brothers, you see. They're still our neighbours. It's funny, I've spoken to, I remember speaking, well, more than once this has happened, and I will stress the need to love thy neighbour as thyself, and how powerful that idea is. And people sometimes will agree with me, but they will then qualify it by saying that there are certain neighbours that really don't fall into the category of the ones that you should love, because they're annoying. Perhaps they break in and steal. Perhaps they curse loudly and play music in the night. And they're irritating in general, and those aren't the sorts of neighbours that you're meant to love. But those are the very neighbours that you should love, in fact, that we are ordained to love. Not the nice ones. Niceness is a very overrated quality in a person. And always the countenance of one man sharpeneth another. And we learn from our interactions with our brothers and sisters. And we remember that we are all fallen. And so to judge another is not, it's not given unto us to do so. The Bible makes it very clear that there is one judge and one lawgiver. The beam and the mote is an important parable in this respect. And it applies to the Pride March as it applies to all spectacles of overt ungodliness, of turning away from Christ. And we're surrounded by it, and we can find it in our own heart also, because it is our nature as a fallen race. So it is, and gradually we are lifted out of the dust. The more we place our trust in Jesus Christ and walk peaceably among men and engage in works, but the improvement that's needed is your own. It's not our business to map out the improvement of another man, even though he may be an alcoholic or a a drug addict, or a thief, or a fornicator, a backbiter, things that Paul mentions. Disobedience to parents is quite widespread. Malignity is quite widespread. People become disgusted by the behavior of some of their neighbors, and so they withdraw their foot. But they're still our neighbors, and there's still a mirror somewhere in your house that you can look into and see the wickedness in your own heart, and then understand the need to apply the beam and the mote parables to all interactions with our brothers and sisters. That's very important. I suppose I've spoken critically of the attitude of women quite a lot recently, but this matter still applies throughout. This is how we build the kingdom of God, isn't it? By loving one another and by being kindly and understanding, and not standing on a few verses that Paul has written and misinterpreting them as applying only to a certain group of people. Because we are all condemned and freed only by the grace of Jesus Christ. Now, there are many men and women that don't have any conception of that grace because they've turned away and they've relied on their own understanding and their own resources, and feel no need to appeal to the grace freely offered by Jesus Christ. Well, they're deceived in that, and the world has deceived them, and the church in particular has deceived them. The church's role is to draw people away from Christ. It's shocking, really, it shocked me when I understood that. But it's very clear to me. And so the church age, as it were, is drawing to a close. And I think it was unjust from its very beginnings. Because when Christ rebuilt the temple through his sacrifice, he didn't call the masons to construct it. It was our forefathers that brought in the masons and built some quite sometimes elaborate structures to loudly proclaim their devotion, but our nation really has always walked proudly and uplifted. Lip service has accompanied all forms of worship since the very early days. And so now the time comes for clarity, the revelation of principles, and the removal of judgment. And I think the most obvious place to remove it is down in the gay quarter or among our gay brothers and sisters, because that's where it's rife. You see, I was meditating upon this matter when I read Jonah, and Jonah's always been an interesting character to me. Why was Jonah such a Pharisee and so proud and ungrateful and unwilling to follow God's instruction to go into Nineveh and to preach the gospel? Because he had no, I suppose, he had no love for those people. They were a wicked nation. I'm sure that sexual impropriety would have been one of the foremost activities within that great city, of all types, of all natures. The worship of idols, their cruelty, their child sacrifice, their inhumane treatment of their enemies. They were quite a rough old lot, those from Nineveh. And so Jonah was disgruntled and reluctant. And even when the task had been done, he complained and actually shook his fist at God, really. A little bit in the way that Job did, you could say. He was angry. But it's odd, isn't it, that God, I don't know whether to say that he mocks Jonah, but he elucidates the principles that show that his anger is really unjustified, because he's been instrumental in the salvation of 200,000 souls and has also saved much cattle in that great city of Nineveh. Now, the salvation of Nineveh was not to be enduring. About 150 years after Jonah's visit there, I think the city fell and the great slaughter followed, and you could call that a judgment from God upon that wicked nation. But that's God, it's not us. We are to go into Nineveh with a friendly countenance and extend our brotherly love throughout the communities that surround us. And use our best efforts to be better men ourselves, to better ourselves, to be more caring and more manly also, to develop our skills in warfare and develop our understanding. That's what we need to be focusing on, rather than condemning this group of people or that group of people because we think that they don't quite fit biblical principles, because we don't fit them either.